Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to take you in, particularly on the infrastructure side, which is the side I know about, but actually delving into one of the organisations that we use that does quite a lot of leverage, although we don't like the term, just so you can see how it works. I thought it would be quite useful just to look through, and it's one of the larger ones in the world. So we prefer the word catalysing or mobilising private sector finance just because of the negative implications of these leveraged buyouts. And everyone remembers Liverpool and Manchester United football clubs. So what I try and do in my world is trying to catalyse private investment for the poorest countries in the world, trying to get economic growth and better services for the poor. And one of the reasons we're trying to do this in the infrastructure space is just the numbers. And if you look at the infrastructure requirements, the Africa country infrastructure diagnostic came up with a figure of $93 billion a year that Africa needs to invest to get its infrastructure up to scratch. And developing Asia actually came up with a figure of $750 billion a year that they need to invest, which I think is a reflection of the ambitions rather than the need. But the world construction value of what's going on, the whole industry, is $7.5 trillion at the moment, predicted to grow to $12 trillion by 2020. Now, aid is just a fraction of these funding requirements. There just isn't enough aid in the world. I don't know, you can do the maths, but if you take total aid in the world, divide it by world GDP, I come to 0.02%, which just gives you an indication of the what you can do if you start leveraging some of that other money that's out there. So here's a really good example. I worked in Mozambique most recently. The total aid going to Mozambique over 10 years, from 1995 to 2004, was $10.9 billion. And Eni, the Italian gas giant who found gas off the coast, have just announced they're going to invest $50 billion in one liquefied natural gas plant in a little gorgeous town called Pemba, which will probably spoil it forever. But that's just an indication of the different scales that there are in this world. So drilling down into one in particular, which is it's called the Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund. Anyone ever heard of Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund? It's a PIDGE facility. I did not come up with these acronyms. I inherited them, and I curse the man who invented them. But Private Infrastructure Development Group is one of the world's younger multilaterals, and it's a suite of facilities trying to get private investment going. And there's at the back I've brought their annual report from 2010, and I can give people links to their websites and things if you want to find more about the whole thing. But Emerging Africa is their largest facility, and I just want to drill into how that works. We call it intelligent use of public funds. It's not called returnable capital, we call it redeployable capital. So we put funds in as equity. So in the end, if this EIF was ever wound up, we could get our money back theoretically. And the total donor equity that's gone in, it's a 10-year-old facility, is $139 million, of which 70% is UK money. So what happens with that money is we give it to a trust fund, and then that's held, we're like nominee shareholders of this company. And the donors sit on a council who direct the PIDGE and tell people how we want that money used. So we're like shareholders of some private company, and we come up with a mandate for a board. Now, the board is composed of non-executive directors who are recruited in the open market from private sector firms. And they sit just like a normal private sector company board. The chairman has the primary responsibility to talk to the shareholders until it goes bust, and then they'd have to talk to other people. But their primary responsibility, like any director, is to their shareholders, who in this case are the governments who've put the money in. So then that board is given a mandate by the donors who sit on the council, and they say, we want you to do this, this and this with the money. And then they recruit management, and they incentivise management, who are again private sector, to go and deliver against that mandate that the donors set. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the mandate in a minute. What the management then do is they take the donor equity and then they can use that to attract in debt into their facility. So they can get debt finance, they can get bank loans. And various people have lent them money. They've got some money commercially from people like Barclays. They've got some money from development finance institutions, such as FMO in the Netherlands. They've got money from the African Development Bank most recently. So a mixture of sort of semi-private, government-owned DFIs and pure private finance coming in at that level. And that obviously they have to pay interest to those organisations on that debt. So then they sit with that fund of money. And then they again do a second leverage, if you like, at project level, because they have to try and find projects where they're going to use that money to attract in a lot more private investment to come in and make those projects a reality. And one of the key things that we're going to talk about is additionality. We say that their projects have to be additional. They wouldn't have happened without the public money. So what they've achieved in 10 years, the cumulative private sector investment that they've got is $8.2 billion, using $139 billion of donor money, invested in infrastructure projects that we think wouldn't have happened without this being around. Now, that's an astonishingly high leverage. We expect it to decline because we're ever tightening their mandate. We made it quite easy for them in the early days, and, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But they're going to get into ever more difficult countries and ever more difficult sectors, and therefore we can't expect them to attract quite so much private investment. So the mandate that we've given them, they have to work in sub-Saharan Africa, in DAC 1 and 2 countries only. Every project they do has to prove that it's additional. They have to prove to them, the shareholders and the board, that it wouldn't have happened without the public money being there, that the private sector wouldn't have gone ahead on it anyway. They look at affordability and trying to make sure that the costs of it are affordable to the end users. Very, very often, poor people are already paying such a high price for services that things, no matter what you do, it's going to be affordable to them. But it's a key test. Often they're paying very high prices, but for very small quantities. So you have to look at whether giving them a connection to, for instance, to the electricity grid, they pay less per unit, but can they afford actually to have that electricity in the household, and are the tariffs fair? It has to be in infrastructure, because it's an infrastructure fund. And we are gradually changing the mandate, as I said. So we're telling them that we would like them to work in more fragile and post-conflict states, and to really emphasize sort of all the traditional DFID sort of stuff that we're interested in, and trying to tackle the more difficult sectors. For instance, trying to get more investment flowing into water and sanitation, which has seen very, very little investment going into it. So I just want to quickly run through 3 projects just to give you an idea of some of the things they've funded. CCOM cable, people might have heard of the CCOM cable, which is the fibre optic cable along the east coast of Africa. This is it being laid, I think the start of some cliff somewhere. And it has transformed internet access in Eastern Africa. For instance, in Tanzania, the broadband capacity, the bandwidth, went up by 1,000% when this cable went in. EIAF put in $35 million into this project out of a total investment of $375 million to make it a reality. And this project was sitting around waiting to happen, and no one could tie up the finance. In emerging Africa, didn't just put money in, but they acted as the herder of cats to get all the people to finance this project to happen. With big development impact, I think. Second one is Olkaria 3. Has anyone been to Hell's Gate Park in Kenya and seen the geothermal plants? Olkaria 3 is the first private sector geothermal plant in Kenya. So it's more efficient than the first 2 that were put up, and it was put up by a private company. Again, Emerging Africa put in 15 million out of a cost of 179 million of that geothermal plant. Kivu Watt is the most recent signing of theirs. It's on Lake Kivu in Rwanda. Lake Kivu has a lot of methane in saturation in the bottom of the lake, which is 500 meters deep. And if it ever lost its layers, then people around the edge would get suffocated, as has happened in other lakes, but nothing on the scale of Kivu. But if you put a pipe down and release the pressure, methane comes bubbling to the surface, and you can generate power with that. And you can also turn methane into carbon dioxide, which is really, really good greenhouse gas-wise. So it's a win-win-win situation. 25 million went in from Emerging Africa to make the first pilot phase of that happen out of 142 million investment. So those are just some of the projects. Now, one of the other sides to the whole thing on leverage is the demonstration effects, and we're always looking for demonstration effects. The great example is in telecoms, and this is why their leverage rates are going to go down, because we've now told them no more mobile phones, you've done the job. But Emerging Africa were the first investor with Mo Ibrahim. They actually enabled Mo Ibrahim's Celtel network to start off. 10 years ago, everyone said, what the heck are you doing? No one in Africa can afford a mobile phone. This is a waste of time. What a stupid idea. Now everyone says, well, why on earth didn't you just leave that to the private sector? You shouldn't have gone there with public money. You can't really win. But the fact is they were the first investor with Mo Ibrahim, and it's become an incredible demonstration effect. And we would love to see how you can replicate that in other sectors. It's like the Holy Grail. But probably you can't, because it had such unique characteristics. But nonetheless, if they can do demonstration effects, if Olkaria can attract other people to invest in geothermal power across Africa, if other... CECOM has attracted other people to invest in cables around. There are demonstration effects there. Really, really important. Just very, very quickly on affordability. One of the key things in leveraging you have to consider is the cost of finance. That's one of the key things in this country on PFI, is that government in this country can borrow at much cheaper rates than the private sector. Economists will tell you that should always be true in every country, but it's much more fudged in some of the countries we work in. But it's a key consideration, is how much that finance for that investment is going to cost if you bring in the private sector. You've got to think about user tariffs, as I mentioned before, but you've also got to think about innovation and better management of your resources that private sector can bring. If they've got to provide a return to their investors, they've got to keep that plant running. They've got to invest in maintenance and operation, and they've got to innovate in getting the best ideas coming forward. And finally, there's the thing of competition, because very, very often in these countries, in infrastructure, you see single-source deals, and people coming up and going to government saying, we'll do this for you on a private sector deal. But it's just us, and the government never gets any competition. They never look at the alternatives and the alternative pricing, and it's a key area you've got to look at. Just finally, on infrastructure private investment, they always say one of the key things is apportioning risk between government and private sector, and the risks that you can control are the ones that you should accept. But risk is a huge issue, especially for the private sector in these areas, and very, very often they are so adverse to taking on any risk. It's really, really difficult to persuade private sector investors to take on any risk if you're getting them to invest in these risky countries. And they really do need to be stroked and have their hands held if you're trying to get them in. Bankers don't like risk, and it is really, really difficult to get them to take on the risk we'd like them to take on. So that's a quick drill through on Emerging Africa.